welcome to Circling Dialogos and my conversation with Adam Coutts. More about Adam in this conversation in a moment. First, some housekeeping. If you are interested in working with me for some one-on-one coaching, what you want to do is just email me. My email's below, and what we'll do is then schedule a consultation call where we'll basically determine whether or not coaching with me is a fit for you right now. And so go ahead and if you're interested in that, just email me and then we'll set that up. Also, the Circling Institute, which is my company, has the Sovereign Circling Intensive this weekend, which is, let me see here, it's July 23rd and 24th. That's from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m., both Saturday and Sunday, Pacific Standard Time. And that's all on Zoom. And so this course is a deep dive into sovereignty, into living from the inside out, and all of the language, the communication skills, and the way of being in the world that afford a ever deepening sense of sovereignty. It's an amazing experience. It's a deep dive, and it's almost all of it's purely experiential. So if you're interested in that, the link for all the information is below. Also, the Art of Circling practitioner training, if you are interested in learning to facilitate circling, is also open for enrollment, and that starts the end of August, I believe. So we still have some openings left. I think there's still a discount at this point. All the information for the Art of Circling is in the link below. All right, I think that's all housekeeping. So I'm really, really excited to introduce you to my longtime amazing friend, Adam Coutts. I've known Adam for the better part of 25 years, and I've personally watched him. I can be testimony to the amount of growth I've seen him go through as a person. He's definitely an example of somebody who has really done their own work, and you can see it in the transformed way in which he responds to the world compared to when I first met him. He's a unique, beautiful man and has a very unique mind. His emphasis and what he's most grounded in and known for is he's a meditation teacher. And in the last number of years, in my view, he's been doing some groundbreaking work with the connection between meditation and how it benefits ADHD. He struggled with ADHD as have I for all of our lives. And there's a way that Adam approaches that with meditation that he's just got some really interesting distinctions. And we go into that quite a bit in this conversation. We also connected on the history of where we first met, which was in circling and in the communities before circling. So you get privy to some conversations of way back when for both of our histories and the history of circling, and I would say part of the history of the human potential movement itself, at least from our little corner in the Bay Area. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. I absolutely did. Enjoy. Okay, everybody. So I am super, super stoked to be talking with my longtime friend, Adam Coutts, and meditation. I consider him a meditation expert. He provided me with the first formal training I've ever had in mindfulness, and this is years ago. And I remember I first got you and I go so way back, and you're so connected to all the things that are just crucial and important to life forming for me in my life. But I remember the first time I met you was on the porch of Erwan Devon's house. I think this was back is before everything. It's probably 1997, 98 or something like that. And I just remember you, you're always such a character. Like you just completely stuck out and always talked a little bit different than all the other weird people I was hanging out with at that time. And your experience and the kind of the spaces that we dwelled in together, right? From the very beginnings of Arate, and you even go back to all of the pre-communities that, right, that were there, that kind of circling kind of in some sense was an evolution of or came out of. You were involved intimately with that. And as an experience I had just last week, reminded me of that you in some sense seem to have had the role in our world of being in some sense the one who caringly tracks the history of things, like cares about the history of things, cares about who started what, when, who was influenced like what, and all the different like traditions that come into, say, like circling and the men's movement, and your particular mind and your heart seems to gather that history, and you hold it close to your heart and track it. And as we all get older, this has become a real service in a big way. So
appreciate that.
Yeah.
I've never asked you if you've read my blog post. That's the history of circling with all the pictures.
Yeah, I have. I loved it.
All right. It seems like a lot of people in the circling world did. I've never heard that from you. I'm like, I assume Guy has seen that. To some extent, that was a love letter to you and Jerry, you know, like really honoring what you two in particular created. Was my biggest motivation in creating that blog post. Mm-hmm. But I guess it served a lot of other people who didn't know a lot of that history. So that's nice. Yeah. I have a blog post on my blog, intromeditation.com. It's a history of circling. I don't call it the history of circling, but it goes into a lot of the prehistory and we go way back. I think I was in one of your and Jerry's like second or third courses, Sleepy Hollow House. I wrote about that in the blog post.
Yeah, totally. Way back when. Way back. And you, it's interesting because I just remember you and I have had just our own friendship. It feels like just in, through all of that, but like also just distinct from all of that. And I've always felt like with you that you're one of the few people that I could kind of get in deep into and talk about the distinctions of everything that was going on and geek out with, whereas everybody else was like really into the process and the drama of it and like the, all the stuff that everyone was really into. Like you were one of the people that I could talk about like the deeper distinctions and the history of things and the stuff I was reading, and we could get into it. There's a similar tracking of that kind of thing with you as well. So I've just really appreciated that as well with you.
Awesome. Enneagram 5s represent.
Yay. So a little bit of background for you, if you can just get people some orientation about who you are and what you do and when you got involved with mindfulness and personal growth and where you come from and all that kind of stuff. We can start from there.
Yeah. It's a great question. Well, I had a family that was pretty successful as far as these things go, but definitely had some difficulties. So I think I got to my high school age pretty depressed. I don't think anyone knew what ADHD was back then. I think if anyone in the mid 80s knew what ADHD was, you'd barely see my hand poking out from a pile of medications. But looking back on it, that was a big factor for me in terms of, a lot of my behaviors. Like my parents sent me my report cards from elementary school and high school, and like 5-10 years ago, and every single one said does not live up to potential. He's so smart. He understands things so clearly, yet he's late. He talks in class. He ends work in late. He doesn't seem like he's paying attention until he explains things to the other students that I couldn't, So, that sounds pretty ADHD. So I was a pretty suffering person by the time I hit 16, 17. I'd say I was pretty popular in school until a certain point when my family started having a lot of problems, and then that sort of was reflected socially for me.
Mm.
And I think Alfred Adler, Freud's disciple, said the first kid takes after the father, or whatever the father's life script is. Mm-hmm. The second takes after the mother, and the third takes after the parents' relationship. Mm-hmm. So, if that's true, being a second child, I definitely imprinted on my mom. Mm. And when she got really into personal growth, I got really into personal growth. Mm. So I didn't even know what I was doing, but I started going to like a therapy group at 16, 17. They sent me to a therapist because I was all
I didn't know that.
Angry kid.
Yeah. So when you were a teenager, you started your first therapy group.
Yeah. And my mom gave me this book, Adult Children of Alcoholics, and it was like, when you're shame-based, you try and fake it and pretend like everything's cool, and really inside you're hurting. I'm like, I hated the book. Or I didn't hate it, but I was compelled by it. And I was also like, how does this book know? I better, don't tell anyone else. Right. So I started going to 12-step programs when I was 18. And when I got to UC Santa Cruz, and Erwan and I and Chris Burke, a lot of people that you and I know in common, there's a lot happening, saw Ram Dass and started doing sweat lodges, and just I was drawn to anything that might make me a happier person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, so what was it? My summer after my first year of college, I took a Tai Chi class. And the first thing that we did at the beginning of many of the classes was just stand in silence and be aware of our breath for 5 minutes, which is not that long when it comes to a meditation. And man, I was completely overwhelmed. I think I had a lot of unprocessed trauma and also ADHD that was completely not met. So it was completely overwhelming experience, just really intense memories, overwhelming emotions. Yeah. But, I didn't, one thing they say with meditation is sometimes sitting with a group can really help a person face something that they wouldn't otherwise face. I wasn't going to run away and scream. Mm-hmm. So I did the 5 minutes, and I went back for my sophomore year. I started meditating 2 minutes a day, 5 minutes. It helped that some of my housemates were really into meditation. Erwan, third time we're mentioning him, had some audio cassettes by a meditation teacher. I heard them like, this is for me. This, like, I need to learn about. And that guy's been my teacher for 30 years, Shinzen Young. And so I started meditating, and it got to the point by the end of college that I was meditating 40 minutes a day, every day, just holy vow. Like if I had 3 hours to sleep because I was up late writing a paper, I'd sleep for 2 hours 20, do my meditation. If I was falling asleep, I'd walk back and forth to stay awake. So that was pretty cool. And then I still kept doing a whole lot of personal growth work, a lot 12-step, a lot of like, psychotherapy and all sorts of stuff. What I do, like rebirthing groups, and I don't know, it's countless the kind of things that I did. A lot of yoga, a lot of authentic relating groups. But I remember I was at
you're basically all this, the set and setting of this is when you're in college, basically, right? So you're in your
that's what planted the seeds for it. I guess I feel lucky I went to UC Santa Cruz because all that stuff was happening there.
Right.
So in about the mid 90s, there was this old Native American artist guy I knew from Codependence Anonymous, and he was always dating college girls like 40 years younger than him, and Dan Stolpe, and he turns to me at a party and he's like, "Kid, most people are full of shit." I'm like, all right, I can get with that. And he's like, "Nobody really goes for what they really want." I'm like, all right, a little harsh, but okay. He's like, what the fuck's important for you in life? I can curse, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, please.
Okay. What the fuck's important for you in life? I'm like, meditation. He's like, and what the fuck are you doing about it? You ever sat a retreat? I'm like, no. He's like, there you go. And so then a friend said, do you want to sit a retreat? And the Goenka people, I was like, I don't have the vacation time. I was working as data programmer. I'm like, but I kept in mind what he said. I'm like, yeah, I should do this. I should like step into the fire. And that was my first retreat. And I've done about 80 ever since. The Goenka people. Yeah.
And that's basically, just so people understand, that's what
it's 10 days. That was my first introduction to meditation. Well, second one. Is it 10 days? And you sat was about 9 hours of sitting a day, or is it 11 hours of sitting a day?
It's like more. Yeah. It's pretty thorough.
Yeah. No talking, no communicating, completely austere. Yep.
Yeah. Many people that you and I know in common, that's the only meditation retreats they've done.
Right.
They call it doing of Vipassana. So for people that don't know, S.N. Goenka was and I can say more about my background if you want to go back to that.
Yeah, please.
S.N. Goenka was a Burmese businessman of Indian ethnicity, and he was having debilitating headaches. Not a religious person, ancestrally Hindu. He went to this guy Uba Khin, who was this really eminent meditation teacher. He was also the head of 4 different government ministries in Burma. He's just a really high functioning person. For people who might feel like meditation makes a person ineffectual, he was literally running 4 different ministries.
Right.
And so he went to Uba Khin, Goenka, and he said, I have these headaches, can meditation help? And Uba Khin said, yeah, I'll teach you how to meditate, but not to cure your headaches, just for the sake of, being a better person, for the sake of Dharma, etc. So he started meditating, the headaches went away, but Goenka really loved it. And he was a high functioning person also, international businessman. So he had the mission of bringing Buddhism back to India, founded all sorts of meditation centers in India and then all over the world. So before the pandemic, about 250,000 people were taking 10-day retreats through the Goenka organization every year. I think they have 3 centers in California. Yeah. And as you say, it's very sincere. It's very simple, austere. You do three days of breath meditation on the nose, 6.5 days of body scans from the top of the head down to the toes and back up, then half a day of love and kindness. And you can see the seeds of that in the secular, or the influence that's had on the secular mindfulness movement in terms of mindfulness-based stress reduction. Breathing at the nose and body scans are their main techniques. So it's been a hugely influential meditation movement, possibly the biggest. I don't know. So yeah, you've done them, I've done them. That was my first retreat.
And that was your first retreat. I know that for me, that first retreat was like, if all I got, which I got a lot out of it, but if all I got was being introduced to I just remember the first 3 days of focusing on the nostrils, right? Start again, left nostril, right? So I still hear his voice, right, in my head. But within a few hours, kind of realizing that there was a constant sense of discomfort and unsatisfaction and agitation, that virtually realizing practically everything I did was about non-experiencing that. And it just put me right in the center of that discomfort or dis-ease or something like that. And I just remember kind of getting that and sitting there and realizing I couldn't really talk to anybody, and that it was going to be 10 days of just being in these like levels of despair that would come up, and all these things that I ended up kind of dropping deeper then. But I'm so grateful that I went in the deep end of the pool, right, at that place, because I couldn't imagine how many years it would have taken of like just an hour a day, in some sense.
Yeah.
What was your experience of that first one? What was that like for you?
My first retreat. Well, I'll be blunt. I don't think this is a very sexy answer. It was just intellectually stimulating just to learn how a retreat worked. I had a very active mind about how does this, how are they structuring this? What are other people doing? That was my first retreat. I think I did some deep work. I did extensive writing afterwards about it, but I haven't reviewed that in a while.
Yeah.
I've done 80 retreats in America and Asia since then, maybe more. So I can tell you how retreats are in general for me. It's exactly as you say. There's a lot of sitting still with stuff that is difficult to sit still with. We started talking about Goenka, but as you know, I started teaching meditation 20 years ago, and I've taught a lot of 8-week classes. And I often feel like a lot of what I'm doing as a teacher is holding people up against what they want to wiggle away from. And that's definitely what retreats are. I think that, this experience of intense physical agitation that you encounter in meditation, I think everyone does when they do retreats. I think that there's just a physical suffering of sitting still without distraction and not moving, and sort of really facing how the body feels and what's going on in the mind and on the deeper levels, the subconscious, the soul. That is really unpleasant, but if a person can sit there and really fully face it, there's a healing or a cleaning out or an integrating, or however you want to put it, that happens. I do think that for ADHD people, sometimes the element of agitation is more present than for other people. I've learned that. Shinzen, my main teacher, has ADHD, and he often teaches us as like, you sit still and it feels like, I can't tolerate this. There's bugs crawling through my skin. This is just like unbelievably unpleasant. That's my experience on retreats. It sounds like you're talking about that with you. I don't think that's everyone's experience when they sit still for 12 hours a day. I think other forms of suffering are more prominent for people. I've learned that in terms of getting out from my own subjective experience and seeing other people's. But I think there's some sort of thing that a person has been running away from for a long time, that when they sit still for, 10, 12 hours a day, they have to face. And I think it's an incredibly powerful and useful experience. One that I recommend to everyone who's watching this and listening to it, if you've never done it before.
Right. And what would you say, Adam, when those things that come up, right, when you sit still, right, and the things in the background that are like some issue that you haven't gone through, like you haven't faced, you have trauma or some part of the mind, what is it about sitting through it? What would you say, like, how come it comes up by just sitting there? And what happens by just sitting there that affords it oftentimes to be kind of a breakthrough or purifying or?
Yeah. I think of so many ways to answer that. One simple metaphor that I've heard Shinzen say often is, you get you're a miner and you get a chunk of gold from a shaft or something, and it's a big chunk of gold. So that's great. And you bring it to the gold buyer. I don't know how this works, but, and the gold buyer's like, well, that's not pure gold. So, that's not good. And you're like, yeah, it's probably not pure gold. I should probably bring it back when it's pure gold. But what do? You stare at it and you're like, okay, nickel, cadmium, iron, get out. No, you have to heat it up. And when it heats up, it melts. And then the different metals are different strata. And I don't know. So I've heard you can scoop off the impurities and then you have pure gold. But you have to heat it up and you have to get it to melt. And, I think with the psyche, sometimes you kind of got to heat things up. You kind of got to get to a point of like stress, at which point the mesh between the conscious and the subconscious sort of becomes more porous. And doors that are long closed, to bring up another metaphor, open. And then there's a bunch of goo behind the door and you have to mop it up for, a period of time. I think that how that process specifically works with meditation, there's a lot of different ways to meditate, as you know. I think many beginners just hear about breath meditation, and that is the classic starting point. But, there's a lot of different ways to go from there. And however you work with meditation, there is sort of, when we talk about mindfulness meditation, there's a real sitting still with what is. And when you face what is, it heats things up often, and what stuff that's repressed does come to the surface. And there is the opportunity to integrate it, to release, to run the charge off the battery of negative energies in the body, however you want to put it. I'd say for me personally, so much of meditation has been somatic. We talked earlier about being sort of both, you didn't put it in these words, but kind of philosophical guys. And I do, my whole life, I've thought about things. How does life work? And I've had a career as a computer programmer. It's all, I'm on my computer a lot. It's all can be kind of heady. And I think for me, maybe for you, weightlifting, and I think being present with people, those are grounding in sort of Dazen experiences for you. And for me, a lot of it is just feeling my body. I've meditated every day for 30 years, and so much of it has just been noticing where I feel things and deeply feeling them.
Yeah.
And I think if a person's really willing to feel the body, to me, I found that to be the most rapid way to run off charge of whatever I'm holding on to from earlier today, from last week, from a month ago, from my childhood, from past lives, who knows?
Mm-hmm.
So the process of running down the charge for me is often being willing to feel how my body feels, but meditatively, there are other ways to work with it as well.
Mm-hmm. And by feeling your body, you mean like literally like bringing your awareness and your attention directly to sensation as it unfolds,
Mm-hmm.
right? And just sitting with it as it is.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Traditionally, I think in ancient scripture, Buddhist scripture, it was talked about like an arrow piercing the body. I think I've heard Shinzen, my main teacher, talk about that's a little violent. It's a little like, repulsive to some people. So we like to talk about it as like water soaking into a sponge, like the consciousness soaking into how the body feels. Yeah.
Right. And isn't that a big part of, there's that part of meditation, which is about developing concentration, right? And sitting with whatever's there and bringing your attention back when it drifts, bringing your attention back. And that's one part of it that gives you the ability to concentrate, to go into, what is it? Like the word I understand of is vipassana, which is more like insight meditation, right? Where you start to bring your attention to the way reality works and investigating reality. And there's, I know that people don't necessarily always make that distinction when they talk about meditation, but they're very distinct. They're very complementary, but they're distinct things, aren't they?
Mm-hmm. Do you want me to talk more about that?
I'd love to. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, a distinction that I have, there's an even more meta distinction than that, which is what I've learned to call cultivation meditations and mindfulness meditation. Cultivation is like petitioning God, like, God, would you please bring this into my life? Mindfulness is more listening to God, like clearing yourself out so God can speak to you. Two different kinds of prayer.
Yeah.
Mindfulness is like noticing how the body feels, the rising and falling of thoughts. As you look around a room, what sort of colors do you see? Just life as it is. However your breathing is, let that be. But I think there's also a very valid form of meditation that I used to 30 years ago think was really hokey or besides the point or weak, which is intentionally deciding I'm going to use the power of my attention to choose to be a certain kind of person. So classically in Asia, that would be like cultivating gratitude for your ancestors. The classic form of cultivation is love and kindness. Like, I want to feel more warm-heartedness to myself and for the world around me and other people, all beings. So I'm going to generate, visualizations or a warm feeling in my heart. If a person, if a business coach is like, well, lie down and really envision, a 8-figure valuation IPO and really feel how that feels, right? You're creating a new reality. You're asking the universe for something, and you're using your power of awareness to do that. You're not encountering what is. You're not in your yin reception to perceiving reality as it is. You're yang penetrating reality, like, this is how I'd like it to change. If a psychotherapist is like, okay, lay down, and I want you really to visualize the love of your life. Okay, really feel that, right? That's a cultivation. And I think, like many young men, when I was younger, I'm like, give me the mindfulness. I want to face how things are, right? Like we were talking earlier. I think in my teaching more recently, I cap off mindfulness sessions with gratitude or forgiveness meditations, forgiveness for self, imagining asking for forgiveness from another, imagining giving forgiveness to another, really feeling good memories and really activating those warm feelings, envisioning future success, and of course, love and kindness. I have a whole brace of cultivations that I would not have taught 20 years ago, really. But now I see mindfulness by itself, one of my teachers used to say, can be so stark and so confronting that it's nice to have a little bit of, good vibes, cultivating intentional warm-heartedness and these good sort of things with your power of awareness if you're going to do a meditation session. So the highest level distinction I make is between cultivation and mindfulness.
Yeah. Okay. Cultivation and mindfulness. Totally.
That's my language. I mean, I haven't heard other people use that exact language, cultivation versus mindfulness, but I've seen that, I've started recording for Insight Timer. Now, on Insight Timer, a huge percentage of the meditations are cultivations. Like visualize, you're feeling the warmth of the sun and it empowers you, and you feel like I can do anything tomorrow when I wake up. That's not mindfulness, but it is a meditation. So you were talking earlier about the path of mindfulness, though. So I'll launch into that.
Sure. Yeah.
You're open to it?
Yeah, totally.
The most essential teaching in Buddhism, the Buddha said this repeatedly, I think I've heard other teachers say this, is the Four Noble Truths. The Buddha said the Four Noble Truths is like an elephant footprint, and you can put a deer footprint, a mouse footprint, a horse footprint, all these other things inside an elephant footprint. He said all of the various teachings of Buddhism and meditation in the Buddhist lineage, etc., can fit in the Four Noble Truths. So the first Noble Truth, you're not as happy as you pretend to be. We act like life's okay, but we all have some sort of, like, in Buddhist theory, unless we're enlightened, that we have sort of some level of disease or angst, or like things are not, something's worrying us.
Yeah.
The second Noble Truth, it's because of impurities of mind that's the case. Mm-hmm. The third Noble Truth, you could have a radiant okayness with reality as it is if you work out these impurities. Mm-hmm. And the fourth Noble Truth is you have to work for it.
Yeah.
So the fourth Noble Truth is also the Eightfold Path, different steps of psycho-spiritual growth that a person can do to be a more happy person, a more open person, a more clear person. And those are, hope I'm not hitting whoever's watching this up with too much at once, but I'm going to go with it. Those can be divided into the three trainings. And the three trainings are basically like ethics. You start with cleaning up your life.
Yeah.
Like Shinzen, sometimes people come to him and they're like, I want you to teach me meditation. And he says, I need you to go AA for a year and then come back to me. I can't teach you how to meditate right now. You're drunk every night.
Right.
And if a person went to a Zen monastery, the first thing they would teach them isn't non-duality and how to be one with the universe so that you transcend, good and bad. They'd say, do good, be honest, do what you say you'll do, work hard. They have the monks do that for a while before they transcend the notion of good and bad. Yeah. So, in America, people go to a meditation center and the first thing they learn is meditation. But I think my understanding is traditionally in Asia for lay people or monastics, the ground is ethics. Tell the truth. I like to think of ethics beyond religions and just sort of cross-culturally as having four elements. Tell the truth. Don't engage in violence for any reason except self-defense. Right. Don't steal, and don't be an addict. That's sort of the basic of ethics. So that's sort of the starting point of meditation practice. Then you move on to concentrating the mind. You talked about that, which is the mind wanders away, you bring it back. The mind wanders away, you bring it back. It's like playing musical scales. It's like doing language drills. It's like lifting weights. It's simple, it's repetitive, it can be boring, but you're building a strength called your mind. You choose where you want your mind to go, and it more or less stays there. Yeah. And I think there are people in this world that think that's the end of the line. Like, okay, the point of my meditation is for me to calm down and clear my mind and just feel my breath. Okay. And that's not at all. As you said, at least in Buddhism, that's seen as a tool for then using that concentrated mind that knows what it's aware of and is not unconsciously drawn into flights of thought, but can kind of discipline itself to kind of come back from those flights of thought and stay conscious. That's a useful tool. Then you can take that powerful consciousness and apply it to everything, including thoughts, how your body feels, the sounds you hear, the rising and falling of emotions, anything. And then you start to realize the flow of life, the impermanence of things, the interconnection of all things, etc. And that's when you're illuminated. So the theory goes. So you start with ethics, Shila or Sila, depending on whether you're speaking Sanskrit or Pali. Yep. Then you move into Shamatha or Samatha, concentrating the mind. Yep. And then you move into Vipassana or Vipassana. And that's sort of being open to reality the way it is. I like to think of it as like you're chopping down little leaves. That's kind of being an ethical person, getting your karma in order. Yeah. Then you start chopping down the big branches. That's concentrating the mind. And then the trunk of your suffering and your alienation from infinity and your stopped upness and all of our angst.
Right.
is the big trunk of the tree, and that's what insight meditation vipassana
And that's particularly
supposed to handle.
That's the one, that's the where the Buddha really that's a lot of what he brought to things was that last thing that you just said, the vipassana, right?
I think that's Buddhist propaganda. I think probably other people in India 2,500 years ago probably had some pretty sophisticated meditations. Yeah. But the Buddhist story is that the Hindus and the Jains and all that, they hadn't figured out the final step, and the Buddha did. Yeah. That's what they say.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, totally. And it's about, and that part is essentially, when I think about that part, is this correct to think about it like this? Kind of like when you can concentrate, right? It's so that when you bring it on some aspect of your identity or even a sensation, that you can start to investigate reality, right?
Exactly. Like the mind is too scattered and too unconscious to really experience anything until you discipline it. Mm-hmm. That's the theory of, ethics, concentration, insight. Mm-hmm. That the concentration is usually a important step before doing the work of insight. Yeah.
Right.
And I think I know people have meditated for a long time and they've never heard this distinction between insight and concentration. And there's more to it theoretically than we've just talked about. But I think if a person really groks it, it clears up a lot of theoretical confusions people have about what technique to do when and how do they all fit together. And if my mind's this way today, what technique would work best for that?
Yeah. That's why I think, that's why I'm glad because I went to your very, very first meditation. It was 8 weeks. Like
it was 6 back then, and I expanded to 8 a year or two later. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm grateful for that, because it was, I think I can't remember, had I done Vipassana before that, or I can't remember if I did it before or after that, but I
don't think you had.
Yeah. It just I just remembered having those distinctions.
Yeah.
Cleared so much of that up in my mind from the beginning. I think
that's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I can't imagine having to kind of find my way to those things, but it makes it really, 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 really clear the way that you just laid it out. And in fact, you're still to this day, at some point, you're one of your voice or something that you said, or one of the thoughts that I get to let go of in meditation, because you're so anchored in.
I'm gratified to hear that. That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. What I remember about that course and your participation in it is you are the person who, more than anyone else I've ever met, as an untrained mind that was new to meditation, had the most meditative mind. Like the way your consciousness worked was the most compatible with mindfulness, and especially the insight aspect of it. Like I was like, for someone who hasn't meditated, you're really already really attuned to that. That's my recollection. I'm not buttering you up because you're my friend and because I admire you in so many ways. Mm-hmm. That was actually my memory of that course.
Yeah, I remember you saying that. Well, that was just that was really encouraging. Totally. I always thought, because it was just I'm so right brain on some aspect of it, that I always thought that was probably the sense of especially the insight part, that maybe
I'm sorry, I don't know what right brain means.
Right brain is kind of, you could say, is the more of the holistic sense of things, right, where you grasp more of the sense of the whole.
I see.
Instead of the part. So it's like right brain is a little bit more like when you have holistic experiences or non-dual experiences, stuff like that. A lot of right brain, roughly speaking.
Yeah. Honestly, I think of that as N on the Myers-Briggs as opposed to S.
Mm-hmm. So with, what is it that, because you've done, how many retreats have you done? You said 180?
At least 80. At least 80.
Okay, 80. Yeah, 80 retreats, right? That's a lot. That's a lot of sitting. And then you've been teaching now for how many years?
20 years.
20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And what is the, I mean, I kind of want to ask you a little bit about just what did teaching affect your practice? How did teaching affect your practice? Much as like what has been being a teacher been like, and how has it affected you in terms of meditation and waking up? And
Yeah, that's a good question. I've never really thought about it in as direct terms as those. I guess I've kind of thought about it without clearly thinking about it, and I don't really have an answer for you, honestly.
mm-hmm.
I think meditation is such a weird thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, what are you even actually doing?
Mm-hmm.
And I think a person that's new to meditation, that question comes up a lot. Like, is this actually really a thing? Am I doing it right?
Right.
Why am I doing this?
Yeah.
I think those are common thoughts that meditators have.
Yeah.
So it helps to have someone who's like, no, this is really a thing and this is how you do it, right?
Yeah.
And I think if a person meditates for long enough, you're that person.
Yeah.
You're like, I know what this is. I know how it works. I know why I'm doing it. I know, I have generally a sense whether I'm doing it correctly or not. And I trust that this is a real thing that's worth my time. However, a lot of beginners, I think, get thrown off by those questions and stop, like they'll stop in the middle of a session or stop. I think people have a blessing now in that it's as close as your phone. There's tons of these apps, or you could just go to YouTube and have a guided meditation, although I think a lot of the YouTube ones are low quality. You could go to Insight Timer. They've got literally, I don't know, tens, hundreds of thousands of guided meditations there. So you don't have to hold the whole thing of like, what am I doing? Do I really want to be doing? It's like you get the voice in your head of Andrew Pudsworthy or whatever his name is from Headspace, being like, come back to the breath. And you're like, oh yeah, that's what I'm doing. Yeah. But so I had those questions at the same, at the very beginning of my practice. I remember once a mutual friend of ours, we were seeing Thich Nhat Hanh at Spirit Rock in Marin, and he said, meditation makes a man wimpy and unattractive to women. It makes you kind of passive and weak. I'm like, yeah, it probably does. And so I've meditated pretty much every day for about 35 years now, but I stopped for a year at that time. I didn't meditate much because I was like, oh, that's true. And then finally I'm like, that's not true. That's dumb. I like meditating. And so I went back to it. And I don't think it's true at all. I think the opposite is true. Yeah. It can really make a human have a lot of vitality that can be charismatic. But so that threw me off. But so I think if anything, being a teacher has really solidified for me just a sense, this is a real thing. This is how it works. It's really deep within me. There's a Hindu parable that if you have a sapling and it's got and the deer can eat the sapling to death. You need to put a fence around it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But if you have a full-grown tree, the deer can come and take shade in the sun. You get it? You get what the point here is?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that, a person might be new to circling and they're like, okay, I do this weird thing. They don't do stuff like that. And they go to their friends and like, hey, I'm doing this thing. I tried it out on Thursday night. And their friends are like, oh, what's that? No, that's a cult, or that's like, that's like for weak people, or I don't know what the deer would eat at. They'd be like, you got to watch that. That could mess with your mind, or I don't know what people would say. Yeah. Like, that's stupid. And then the person will be like, oh yeah, maybe I shouldn't go back. Whereas if a person's done 10, 20 years if someone said to me circling's dumb, I'd be like, tell me more about your weird ideas, Right. Like I've done enough. I know what it is. It's in my bones. And it's the same thing with meditation. Like, that was enough to get me to stop meditating for a while. But if I was sitting next to someone on an airplane and they're like, yeah, meditation, that's how Satan gets into you, or that's, what people who can't handle life do. I'm like, tell me more about your crazy idea. Like, I'm really interested. Like, it wouldn't shake me in the least. So right. I think that's a benefit for me.
Yeah.
I'd say being a teacher, the impact it's had less on my practice. I mean, that's me trying to connect it to my own meditation practice. Like I'm more grounded in it, and like, this is real. This is what I'm doing. This is how to do it. I think it's developed me as a person in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
And I can talk about that if you're interested.
Yeah, totally. How has it impacted you as a person? Because I know I could say the same thing about teaching. Like, teaching is like, having to teach the thing that you're most interested in learning, right? Is, I mean, that's a cliche, but it's so true. And it's like in when you have 40 people or something, right, listening to you, right, there's a certain kind of rigor that's called forth out of me, and so much more at stake in that moment. So it seems to draws out like the part of me that can most do the hard thing, can most stick with and go a little bit further. There's a certain kind of feedback loop between teacher and student that has been just right over time. I would say that it's developed me in a big way.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you're talking about watching you work with people. You're present with people, you're really tracking them, you're sort of grounded in the moment. And those are motions of the soul. Those aren't motions necessarily of the intellectual mind. I mean, I've seen you really get people in a sort of a way that I can see the wheels turning in your head. Like, this is how the world seems to them. But I think a lot of it's in your heart or in your body or in your soul. So, when you're talking about there's a level of rigor, I see that in both. And the same thing is true for me. I think I've had to clarify my thoughts about meditation. And I've for 20 years now, I've worked a lot on written materials that have really clarified how I see the thing. But it's also required a lot of clarity in who I am. I mean, I assume you would agree, like, you kind of have to take care of yourself if people are coming to you, putting their hearts in your hand.
Yep. Exactly.
It takes a level of responsibility and adulthood to be strong enough for other people to lean on. I think when I started teaching, if someone saw me as a teacher, I noticed this, I would do something shitty to them just to kind of have them not put me on a pedestal, because I didn't like being seen as someone's spiritual teacher. And now there's so many people that see me as that I'm fine with it. I'm fine with being that. It doesn't mean I'm a perfect person, but I seem to be a mental health point for a lot of people. That voice that you have in your head, I think I'm the voice for a lot of people in their head, telling them to open to their experience, telling them to just feel how their body feels, telling them, they're perfect just the way they are, and they could use a lot of improvement simultaneously. Like all these things that are guideposts for a person. I've had to get okay with taking responsibility for that for people. I think, there's levels of self-care I have to do to be a vessel of goodness for other people. I think, I have to show up on time. I have to kind of have myself prepared, so that that's not who I was in high school. I'd also say one other thing about being a teacher, which is, it's similar to everything I've just said. I took a teacher training last year, and I was, I think by far, it was my teacher Shinzen Young's system has a spin-off company run by other people. That teaches system. It's called Unified Mindfulness. So I took their second level teacher training called Pathways, and I think by far the most senior teacher there. A lot of them were beginners, and I've been teaching for 19 years. So I was kind of I kind of did a lot of teaching for the beginner teachers in addition to the main teachers. That's my take on what happened. And a lot of the beginner teachers had questions like, what do I do if I'm tired or in a really bad mood and it's time for me to teach? Like, I have a client or I have a class coming up. Or what do I do if I feel like a fraud and I don't feel like I deserve people's attention to be a teacher? Or what do I do if, I just was jamming my face full of Haagen-Dazs yet again and calling myself a fat pig, and felt sick with myself, and then it's time to teach. What do I do? Some variation of this question came up with a lot of the people. And I, again and again, I said, I've got an answer for you. And they're like, okay, this is a tough question. And I'm like, I have a simple answer. It's get your attention off yourself. You have 5, 10, 50 people showing up, putting their hearts in your hand, expecting you to have an answer for them. They're trusting you. They're willing to open themselves to your guidance in a way that they wouldn't with most people. They're putting aside their time, and in some cases their money, to really kind of try and look for some hope with all their suffering in life. If you can put your attention on, can I do that person any good? And really, not am I good enough, but what can I do here to help? That motion really just evaporates so much bullshit and so much extraneous stuff and so much like, I remember, I still don't make a living at it. I still have a normal job, but I remember I talked to one of my Zen teachers. I'm like, I don't know how I can make a living, and I was trying to figure all this stuff out. And is it okay for me to charge for this or that? And she's like, how about, I have a suggestion for you, Adam. I'm like, well, what's that? And she's like, how can I do the most good for people? Yeah. The Bodhisattva vow.
Yeah.
And I think just orienting myself to that, like actually, what's the good impact I can do on these people coming through? It just really cleans me out and makes me a better person in so many different ways.
Right.
So I just love how that's developed me as a person.
Totally. I really connect with that. And then when you teach and then you start to you have responsibilities and commitments based on teaching, that's where that orientation of being a good person like becomes what's necessary based on what you're responsible for. And I know I totally have a complete, every cell of my body understands what you're talking about. I can't tell you how many times like I've been in the worst mood and like I have a coaching session or I have to teach a course and I'm like, God, I'm the last person in the world that could ever do this. And then I just show up and I just step into that intention. And before I know it, I find myself in one of the more profound experiences I've had teaching, right?
Yeah.
Over and over and over and over and over again. That's so when is especially the thing about this there's something seems so fundamental about this, that there is something about suffering that it has a propensity to draw attention towards it, right? Like, and to be able to consciously bring your attention off yourself and onto something else, right? Even when you're suffering, right? Is the most powerful thing that I've ever learned to do, right?
Yeah. Shinzen likes to say there's two different ways of working with anything difficult, whether it's physical or emotional. One is to put your full attention on it and fully experience it, and really like water soaking into a sponge of how the body feels, noticing the rising and falling of difficult thoughts, whatever it is. And that's the classic mindful way of working through things. But sometimes things are so intense, it's just like you get, like they say in AA, I'm glad for my drinking because it kept me alive, because my life was so painful I would have not made it through if I didn't have the out of the drinking. So there's ways of using the intentional power of concentration to take your attention away from something that's really unpleasant. So an example would be you have insomnia, you have all these spinning thoughts, am I going to get enough sleep? I got the presentation early tomorrow. And one thing they say, insomnia experts, put your attention on your hands and feet. There's not much emotions or thoughts in your hands and feet. Yeah. So intentionally using the power of concentration to take your attention elsewhere. Another example would be if you're roiled with internal emotions, doubts, and obsessive thinking, put your attention really on what Shinzen calls focus out, the sounds you can hear, the sights you can see, and the touch of your body on your environment. Yeah. And there's something grounding and simplifying about that just really, you don't necessarily work all the internal stuff out. There's a different time and a place for that. But as you were saying, like, I think intentionally putting your attention outside of ourselves, it can sort of like really simplify a lot of the choppy waves inside. Yeah. I want to tell a story from your life, if I may. Mm-hmm. I hope this is okay for me to share. You're such an open book. I've noticed you model authenticity by being really open about your human sides. So I've always seen you as really someone who lives the Bodhisattva vow and really committed to the awakening and happiness and opening of other people. Mm-hmm. And just naturally having that compassionate heart. I've always enjoyed that and trusted that and been drawn to that about you. But I remember you went through a dark patch, I think about 9-10 years ago. And I was hanging out with you at Ken Vonoski's house in Alcatraz. And I remember you were wearing like a Mexican zarape, and you were sitting there and you're like, I don't care about other people's pain. I'm like, you are not okay right now, because this is not the guy that I know. Right. Like there are other people that might say that, but like, oh, that's just you being you. But I'm like, that is not Guy. Yeah. And so I think, you got back in community, and I think you pulled yourself out of that dark place. You got back into your work, and then you're back on the Bodhisattva path of just dedicating yourself to, on an industrial level, helping other people to be happier, more open, more spiritual people.
Totally.
But like with what you're saying about being drawn to helping people, I remember that moment just jump. It's like as if you had pulled back, lift the dropping, and had a huge open sore. I was like, something's really, this is not Guy, because this is not the Guy that I've known, my whole life so far.
Totally. That was,
and again,
the dark tunnel.
Yeah, the contrast with who I've known you to be before and since, which is just a solid stand and a mental health point for thousands of people.
Thanks for saying that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. It's like, it's funny. I had somebody who I'm looking at working with, doing some kind of like holding a group, perhaps with CEOs that are like looking at global warming stuff, and kind of just holding a dialogue space for them over a period of time. And he was talking about what brought him up to this point to get him with these CEOs was talked about, like with all of them, they're in their 40s, their early 40s, and that your 40s, he would say, and I've heard different versions of this, but with the way he put it, it's like your job of your 40s is to become someone that you can't comprehend, right? That you go through something that that if you really take it up, right, that you step into a world that you don't see anything underneath your feet, and if you step into it, it will transform you into somebody that you can't comprehend. But there's something about like that. I definitely had to go all the way down in my life, right? And I think what that particular point, right, that period of time was the darkest for me. That is the statement of that darkness, big time.
Yeah. Yeah, well, impermanence, nothing stays the same forever. And I think people go through different landscapes in their life. It's a train that travels through a lot of different terrains. And, Jung got really depressed for a couple of years. And I think a lot of his most fertile thinking and biggest insights came out of that 2 years. I mean,
totally.
It's a real Jungian way of talking and thinking, but I think he says that depression was one of the biggest blessings of his life in terms of what it gave birth to. Perhaps you know that. So you're saying that you're working with a different coach, working with CEOs, and you may work with them. You haven't signed the contract yet, but and that coach is talking with the CEOs about stepping into mystery and becoming a different kind of person that they haven't known themselves to be.
Yeah.
So you're drawing that back to that low point in your life as sort of making a change and sort of bring you through something you couldn't think your way through, but some sort of transformation happened.
Totally, yeah. It just seems to me that there's something, when I look at anybody, like when I really get and sit down and bring my gaze to somebody, I like, what are we looking at when we really look at somebody? It's essentially like you will always outlive whatever conception I have of you, right? There's something inexhaustible, I would say, about life, but especially about human beings, right? We're so much more than we can comprehend often, right? And there's something too about, for me, meditation has been, and this is where it's really linked, I think, for me with my interest in philosophy that's opened up through the years, right? Is that there's something about, there's a part of meditation for me anyways, that seems to be something like a practice that has me, I don't know if you want to put it, dwell or sit or cultivate, like the fundamental disposition of wonder, right? Like just that sense of not wonder in that you see something so fantastical, right, that it's just you're astonished by it, but more like wonder in that the thing that's most close to you, the thing that's most ordinary, like the simple fact of your awareness, the simple way perception happens, like meditation seems to, like, for me, brings my attention to that level of what is mysterious in its nearness, right? Like what's closest to me is also what's most concealed to me. And there's something about meditation for me which is like it has me sit in and cultivate that place to look where wonder happens, right? Of just like sitting here, just be noticing that you're already always aware, right? That it's always, awareness is always this thing that you find yourself already underway in, and you can't find the beginning of it and you can't find the end of it. It's like it's just been this kind of pure thatness that is here that seems to make everything else possible. And in one level, it's the most ordinary thing in the world. It's like the simple thing that your simple being there, right? The only thing you've ever experienced is also can be the deepest mystery in the world. And there's something about meditation for me. I don't hear this part of it talked about much, but I noticed that, like, as time has gone on, meditation has been less, I would say, less about something I'm doing to help myself be less crazy, right? And a little bit more on the side of, this is one of the ways to really trip out about reality, right? Like a way to really kind of see something that's completely ordinary and see how uncanny it is, and how mysterious it is, or how unusual it is, and in some sense afford you to dwell in that, to dwell and be indwelled by that uncanniness or that unusualness or that trippiness, right?
Yeah. Yep. So meditation at some point was a mechanical exercise, maybe designed to reduce suffering, but now it's like you're encountering a freshness or a vividness or an aliveness to life that in a way can't be put into words.
Yeah.
And in a way just leads to more sort of, don't want to say uncertainty because that's kind of a negative state, but wonder, like wonder at the mystery that feels deep.
Totally. Yeah. And then the wonder is, Socrates always says that philosophy begins in wonder, right? Like the investigation, like what draws us deeply participating with reality as such, right? Like is the disposition of wonder. So like in my experience, the like philosophy and reading philosophy and doing a lot of the dialogue work that I'm doing right now and cultivating with John Vervaeke and other people, and meditation are like this for me. They're like this. It's also been that way with circling for me too, is with meditation. It's like,
of course.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure some people call circling interpersonal meditation.
Yeah.
I think I like what I've heard you say. Anytime someone tries to put in one sentence what circling is, it's like it always wiggles out of that box.
Yeah.
Not exactly your words, but I think I've heard you say some things like that. Well, I remember I was listening to Ram Dass once, a recording of him, and someone said to him, how can we remember the divinity of the world, that every moment is perfect in some way? And Ram Dass was silent for a while, and he said, I don't know if there's one reliable way to always remember that the world is an impossible miracle. The same alarm clock that wakes you up one day, you sleep through the next. That's why, spiritual practice is such an art. But he said, maybe just keep asking that question.
Yeah.
And I think it gets to a meditation instruction that I often give people is, imagine you were deaf and all of a sudden this was the first time ever you could hear. Or imagine this was, your last moment on earth. And can you bring that level of vividness to what you're seeing, to what you're hearing, that level of liveness? I think it gets to the idea that the point of the human conscious system is often more more to shut out reality than to bring it in, to perceive reality. You know, there's an old meditation teacher joke or trick to say, feel your left elbow. And then, you know, the person does feel their left elbow. And so, you know, so the meditation teacher, me, whoever, says, what do you notice there? And, well, I feel tingles. I can feel the shirt against it. I can feel it leaning against the chair, whatever. And the teacher says, well, that was all happening before I brought your attention to it. But what were you thinking of before I called your attention to it? You're thinking about, you know, what's Adam saying? You know, do I agree with it? Do I disagree with it? What are the implications of it? What does it mean that the central nervous system blocks out? You know, maybe having a visual image of the brain and the spine. And you know, the body is constantly sending messages, but we often don't listen until it's in pain. You know, it's hungry or banged against something or something, or we're aware of our posture. We're constantly hearing sounds. We you know, walking down a city street, it's like there's cars honking, there's people carrying on conversations, there's airplanes flying overhead, there's all sorts of noise, there's doors opening and closing. We don't pay attention to it. I mean, I've noticed, I'm thinking about, like, you know, how many more blocks till I get there? Will I be on time? What will I order once I get there? You know, it'll be good to see my friend at the restaurant. That's what I'm thinking of. And if someone's like, hey, Adam, I'd be like, oh, me. Okay, that's relevant to me. I should pay attention to that. But besides that, if someone's like, hey, Jennifer, you know, hey, Carlos, it's like, it would just be part of the background. I wouldn't notice it. My central nervous system on some subconscious level would filter it all out.
Yeah.
You know, and if I hear a song and I really like it, I'm like, oh, that's my jam, you know. Then I'm like, oh, I'm grooving on the song. Or it's like, it's the Eagles. I'm like, oh man, I don't like the Eagles. Yeah. Right. But if it's just some song I don't have strong opinions about, it's just part of the background. My consciousness isn't like, hey, let's orient towards that. So there's all these filters, perceptual filters. And one aspect of mindfulness meditation is removing some of those filters. Yeah. And whether it's pleasant, whether it's unpleasant, whether it's relevant to you, whether it's not relevant to you, just open to it all. Just hear it all as part of the symphony of sound all around you. And don't filter out what's not important. Yeah. You know, I listened to another unified mindfulness teacher say last year, mindfulness can make a $10 burrito be like a dinner at French Laundry. For anyone listening who doesn't know, that's the most gourmet restaurant in the Bay Area, you know, $500, and you have to reserve 3 years in advance or whatever. Yeah. It's like just having a really rich and immediate perception without filters of the avocado and the rice. It's just like, it's so sexy. It's so nourishing. It's so fulfilling. It's because you're right there with the experience. You're having the fullness of it. Your consciousness is sinking into the taste and the experience of eating the burrito like water into a sponge. I think one more thing that I'll say about that is Shinzen, his formulation as of 10, 15 years ago is that mindfulness consists of three aspects. There's concentration, which we talked about a while back. Intentionally choosing to pay attention to something and having your attention more or less stay there, right? It wanders away, you bring it back. It's something we cultivate. So that's concentration. The last one is equanimity, which is a Latin word that literally means even-keeledness. It's sort of like, you could call it, you know, it is what it is, non-overreactivity, spaciousness, openness, allowing, maybe even a friendliness or a warm-heartedness with the pain that you encounter, the unpleasant things and the pleasant. You hear some sort of shrieking noise that hurts your ears. You just open to it with friendliness. You hear some sort of delightful melody. You just open to it with friendliness. Mm-hmm. So that's equanimity. But then the clarity part. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of different ways of talking about clarity under Shinzen's definition of mindfulness. But one thing I would say, clarity is a precision of perception. It's flooding the mind with data about something. It's really like, if I'm walking down that city street, just really noticing all the little noises and really the texture of it, the nuance of it. I'm going to grab my little cheat sheet for when I lead meditations. It's bringing details and texture, noticing subtlety, noticing clarity, richness, distinction, precision, nuance, sensitizing, intimacy. It's like, you know, in a circle or doing a coaching session, just really noticing the subtle movements. I think you taught me once about coaching. If a person's talking and they say like, yeah, you know, so my childhood was great, you know, I love my mom, but my dad, and then my you know, sister and brother, like really be riding their words with such carefulness that you notice that they have something about their dad, because you're noticing the nuance of the rise and fall of their intonation.
Totally.
So that's like mindfulness of a client in a session.
Yeah.
And when you can really notice the details of anything, whether it's a body sensation, a thought, a sound, there is an aliveness, there is a vividness, there is a richness, there is a vitality, a awakeness, a fullness.
Yeah.
And the final little notes I have here for my little teaching cheat sheet is the thing that unlocks a lot of that is interest and fascination and curiosity, investigation, exploration. I mean, I've heard from you amazement, open-mindedness. I've heard from you so many times that one thing that you think is a key towards authentic relating, being a coach, being circling, and just being a human is curiosity, not thinking that you know things.
Right.
And what I'm saying is in concentration, clarity, and equanimity, that curiosity and that availability for things to take on a deeper richness and vividness is a central element in Shinzen's formulation and what I've taught for a long time of the clarity aspect of meditation.
Yeah, that's great. It's interesting too, because I had somebody one time ask me, like, what is curiosity? I remember I have no idea, but then I thought, well, I don't know what it is, but it's the first thing that goes when I get pissed or upset, right? Like there seems to be this kind of relationship between contraction or openness and curiosity. And when contraction's there, curiosity goes away. So there's this kind of, and I think what we were talking about before, it's like when you're in a really bad mood and you're really contracted, and then you kind of move towards service, that just the act or the intent of being curious starts to actually open you up. There's an openness that comes with that in a big way. Yeah.
That's great.
And there's
I think
keep going. Yeah.
Just as an aside, I have a little mantra for my relationship of practices that, I sometimes get critical or upset, and that doesn't seem to often get me what I want from my relationship with my partner. But I try and remember 4 things with her as practices. Reflection, reflect back what she seems to be feeling, at least take my best guess. But, when she shares, do reflective listening, especially about the emotions. So reflection, appreciation, even little things. If there's anything I'm appreciative of, express it. Emotional self-disclosure, including anger, but especially sadness or shame or fear, like the things that are more vulnerable. And curiosity, to not assume that I know who she is, but actually ask her who she is and actually be genuinely curious. How was your day? Why do you think you feel that way? What do you want out of that situation? And, when I remember to do what I say, appreciation, reflection, emotional self-disclosure, and curiosity, my relationship seems to go so much better. So curiosity, I find, is a really great relationship tool in terms of my love relationship, as well as sort of like doing good for other people in circling or authentic relating.
Right, totally. And this is also, I know one of the, and I personally think you've in my observation have dove into this more intensely and with more precision than anywhere I've personally seen, which is this connection between ADD and meditation, right? Because I know I've battled with that my whole life. I know that you've battled with that your whole life, and it's often something that's really misunderstood in a lot of ways. But I know that the last number of years, it seems like you put a lot of attention into really, really studying it at a deeper level, right? And working with it. And I know you've written a lot of blog posts on it, and have been having more and more to say about the relationship with ADD and meditation.
Yeah, there's actually one woman who's a nationwide expert. She wrote a book that's kind of like the only book out there. Lydia Z. It's a Polish last name, I forget. And then there, I've just been on 4 different blog podcasts, ADHD podcasts, in the last couple of months, and so looking over the back episodes, there are other people who talk about meditation and ADHD. But yeah, I think I'm really developing stuff, and I think I'm coming up with stuff that I haven't heard other people talk about. So yeah, I'm very excited about it. I recognize that I got into meditation 30 years ago, in part because I had ADHD. I didn't realize it at the time. I don't think people knew what it was then. And yeah, it's something I've at this point I've gotten a pretty in-depth course on the subject. It's if I have a big passion with helping other ADHD people. I have a lot of compassion for them.
Totally. And in your courses that are geared specifically towards working with the ADHD, what are some of the things what are some of the emphases that you emphasize in those courses that make it, that address it? What are some of the distinctions maybe you can share with us that seem to be super pertinent?
I appreciate the question. Do you know Chanel?
I
think she's of Sri Lankan ancestry.
Okay.
I believe.
I think it sounds familiar. Yeah.
She's probably been around your circles in some way. I told her like 5 years ago that I was putting together a mindfulness for ADHD course, and she said, "What are you going to tell people? Meditate?" I'm like, "Yeah, I think that could be the course. Just meditation's good for ADHD people to do it."
Yeah.
But to go into more in depth with that, there's 4 main techniques that I teach in my ADHD work. One is just a simple concentration technique, the breath. It could also be external sound. Just something simple to focus the mind. I know there are some ADHD and meditation experts that say an ADHD person should only do insight practice, not concentration practice, because it's so hard for them to concentrate. I think that's like telling a person who is really out of shape or sickly, don't work out because it's going to be really hard for you. It's like they're going to get all the more benefit.
Yeah.
So starting with just some simple technique to discipline the wandering mind.
Yeah.
And it may be harder for an ADHD person, but I think it's worth it. Yeah. The second technique is, I think self-soothing is so much of an important factor for ADHD people. I mean, with me, I've often kind of gotten in trouble with people by saying things that were provocative or kind of caused people pain. And I think a lot of the answer to that I found getting older is just self-soothing, like noticing when I'm socially anxious, noticing where in the body the tension's building up and just feeling it rather than having it say something that comes out of my mouth to try and like shake up the space. Yeah. And I think also, I think there's so many challenges that come with ADHD. Like, I mean, big challenge I've had a lot in my life is being late. So I'm driving someplace late and I'm just in really, all this like, self-castigation, all that. And just feeling the body just has me arrive more ready to be in actual relationship with people and kind of settle down whatever emotions there. Yeah. So like I said earlier, and there's also the experience of sort of just running off charge, all the agitation that comes with ADHD. A big part of ADHD is always feeling like I got more to do. I'm behind on all that I have to do. I've noticed that's a big what would you call it? Symptom for a lot of people. So just that constant agitation, that's like, life's going to fall apart if I don't get all this to-do list done and I can't do it all, and just feeling that in the body in the moment. Mm-hmm. I think another technique I often teach is awareness of thoughts. Mm-hmm. In Shinzen system, unified mindfulness, thoughts are divided into visual thinking, pictures and movies in the mind's eye, mm-hmm. and then verbal, conversational, analytical, evaluative, mm-hmm. That sort of thinking. Mm-hmm. And so just noticing the rise and fall of those, they can be done separately or together. Yeah. I think a lot of ADHD people, they can, it's very hard to turn off the thinking mind. Yeah. So I think just instead of trying to fight with it, and to some extent you're trying to do that with a breath meditation, but instead just notice it's rising and falling, giving it space. I think that tends to help it calm down. Sort of like with a snow globe, if you try and push down each, flake, it's endless. But if you just watch it, same thing with the mind. And then the last thing is just cultivating love and kindness. Yeah. I think my favorite mantra that I've been working with the last few years is, may I be happy and healthy, and may I be patient, friendly, and forgiving with myself. Yeah. And I just, whenever I get into like a lot of self-castigation, you and I know this, people that without ADHD might not understand just how much failure comes with being an ADHD person, how much social rejection, and how much just failing at stuff, just like saying I'm going to do something and not doing it, setting goals for oneself and not doing them. I mean, I think you're a great success story. You have a lot of self-discipline with your physical workouts. You know, you're successful career-wise. You know, you've really learned how to attune to people. But I know there's challenges there, and I know when you were younger there was even more challenges. And I think I think everyone needs self-friendliness. It's just part of life, but especially an ADHD person. There's just I listened to this ADHD expert, Russell Barkley, and he talks about ADHD kids are often just not attuned to their peers, and they tend to just piss off their peers by being too blunt, by being rude, by monologuing, by like sharing confidences. There's a lot of different ways an ADHD kid will often alienate their peers. The hardest part for an ADHD kid is not the failing the classes. It's often just the social rejection. And so I think ADHD people often emerge into adulthood with a lot of like interpersonal wounds. And I mean, everyone does, but especially ADHD people. And I think like just that, you know, just bringing self-friendliness and just repeating, may I be friendly with myself? May I be friendly with myself? May I be forgiving with myself? May I be forgiving with myself? I mean, you know, they say if a person is like, oh, I'm so fat, that makes it more likely a diet will fail. If a person's like, oh, I'm late again, I'm never going to do that again, how rude I am, that's not the way to be on time next time. The thing is to say, may I be forgiving and friendly with myself? And that sets the framework for a life well lived, such that the person's able to be on time the next time. So, you know, mantra, repeating a phrase. You could also call it affirmation practice. Definitely a cultivation, not a mindfulness practice. Just figuring out an affirming phrase that feels good to a person and really has them sort of settle down and feel more comfortable in their own skin. Another technique that I teach for ADHD people.
Totally. That just that sense of spaciousness, because it's a lot of this is like, I think you were saying to me before about, you know, especially the hyperactive part of ADHD has to do with like not enough epinephrine in the frontal lobes of the brain, right? So you start to crave, and that's usually where people are like overly blunt, or they like, you know, cut people down, or they do something kind of that gets the environment settled because there's a craving because you're essentially understimulated, right?
Yeah, they say with ADHD people, they make good firefighters or ER doctors because usually they're like, reality is boring. You know, there's not enough dopamine and norepinephrine. But then when like the body comes into the trauma unit, it's like, oh my God, exciting. And then then everyone else is like, oh my God, they're bleeding out. And the ADHD person's like, finally, I'm in a happy stimulation level. They're all calm. To my mind, you know, when I wrote the essays I did and really did a lot of reading, listening to podcasts and watching videos about ADHD, for me, ADHD comes down to two main symptoms. One is low motivation in a normal, you know, if I have a big block of time, I just often just don't feel like doing what I need to do, even though I know it needs to be done. Right. That's one big symptom for me. Another big symptom is just less of a filter. I think the frontal cortex, you know, the home of executive functioning, it often does have too rapid reuptake of dopamine and norepinephrine. There's also, if I understand correctly, and different people say different things about this, I don't know if this is true, but my understanding is the anterior cingulate, which is sort of if any neurobiologists are watching this, turn this off, please. Just pretend I'm not saying it. But my understanding of the anterior cingulate is that it's where information in and out to some extent gets processed. Yeah. So there's less of a filter out, which is where monologuing and being really like tactlessly blunt comes in. Yeah. There's also less of a filter in, which is the you know, the classic distractibility of an ADHD person. Yeah. So information in and out. I think ADHD people can often seem narcissistic, and it's not that we're narcissistic. Our brain is not filtering out our thoughts. We're just having tons of creative thoughts bubbling up. Yeah. And we're so filled with ourselvesness that it's hard to get our attention outside. It's not narcissism. It's an underpowered anterior cingulate. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess looping back yet again to the value of putting our attention outside.
Right.
And you know, one last thing I'd say about all that is, you know, I talked about less of a filter out for an ADHD person, and also less of a filter in. I think a superpower that you have and that I have as working with people and as a coach is we notice stuff that other people often don't. Yeah. Why does ADHD exist if it has so many downsides to it in the modern world? And it does. You know, to just say ADHD is just a different way of being. No, there's a lot of things that make it really hard in the modern world. But you think about primeval people, like 9 out of 10 of the hunters were focused on the woolly mammoth, like
Yeah.
We're going to, spew it. And 1 out of 10 was like, looks like it's going to rain. We should probably get back to camp before it rains. Huh. Oh, it looks like there's other woolly mammoths over there. Maybe we should hunt them.
Totally.
Oh, wait, the enemy tribe's sneaking up on us. It helps have one person who's paying attention and not what everyone else is. That's more distractible. Yeah. And I think you and I, like, someone else might be like, okay, so about your mother, and you and I might be like, as coaches, you're really tapping your foot a lot while you're talking about that. Like this thing that psychotherapists and coaches need to be trained to do, we do include the peripheral vision. Right. And that's sort of like a superpower that comes with the negativity of having an underpowered anterior cingulate, is noticing little nuances someone else might not, because our mind wanders a little bit. So that's some of those thoughts.
A little hints into like deeper levels of context that get into meaning and what somebody's saying and all those kinds of things. Yeah.
And someone that's more focused on the overt content of what someone's saying might miss that. So it's that's a reason why evolution might have selected for different types of neurology, and not everyone being the same.
Totally. Because one of the things I was wondering about with this too is, because it seems like one of the things that you taught me was the noting meditation, right? Where you just note whatever's coming up, whenever, like, maybe you bring your attention to your breath. I've just been doing it as of late, just opening, and then whatever it is my attention it starts to consolidate on, just note it. And over time, it's interesting that particularly noting gives me oftentimes this experience of a sense of fullness, like, whereas I think a lot of the struggle with ADHD is this kind of sense of like lack, or there's like not like there's a feeling of like where the emptiness is like a missing of something, right? But there's something about noting that opens up the moment you notice. Something opens up. Like, I don't know if it's the awareness around it, but there's a sense of spaciousness that starts to feel more full. And I've noticed that, like, when there's that feeling of fullness, like in your body and in your periphery of your attention of things, as that fullness is there, I noticed like a lot of symptoms of my own ADHD kind of lessens automatically, right? Because that and this kind of brings it, as we start to come towards a close. I wanted to touch on a little bit about the experience of sunyata and emptiness, right? Which is my understanding especially with the Buddha, right? The main insight, or the main thing that the big deal is to realize, form is emptiness and emptiness is form, right? This kind of transformation, right? In some way of realizing like that the nature of everything is emptiness, right? All the way down. But it's not an emptiness is like a lack of something, but it's something else. So they call it, a book that I've read recently, like a couple of times, Religion and Nothingness, where he talks about the field of sunyata, right? There's kind of this sense of all that is a kind of spaciousness, an emptiness that pervades everything. And that there's something about realizing that is at the bottom of everything that the Buddha says, I think, right?
I think emptiness was something that was more developed 1,000 years later in East Asia. Oh. But you could retcon early Buddhism to have sunyata be more of a central thing. I like what you're saying. I mean, it's sort of central to a lot of what I understand. I like to say that that this world is a dream in God's mind and God doesn't exist. Or I say the dream, the dreamer, and the dreaming are the same thing. And if a dreamer doesn't have a body, where does the dream happen? It doesn't happen anywhere.
Yeah.
I also like the idea that this is a hologram. The universe is a hologram. It's kind of similar to something that I learned in physics class. There are a few things I want to talk to you about. I actually prepared a few things.
Yeah, please.
Before we wrap up. I do want to say something. It's really interesting what you're saying about the fullness with noting. Technically, this is a distinction I didn't have 20 years ago, but I think Shinzen emphasizes this. There's two words that he often uses that I think many meditation teachers might use similarly, but they're actually distinct words. One is labeling and one is noting. Noting is like if you're to do noting with the body, for example, you would notice where you there's so many different ways to meditate on the body. This is one of them. You notice where your attention is drawn. You hold your attention there for 2 seconds and deeply feel it, like the water flowing into a sponge. Right. And then you release and your attention may stay in the same spot, but you don't necessarily have any word in your mind. That's noting. So for example, you're doing sound and you hear a bird and your attention is really drawn there. You really bring your attention to the bird, the sound of the bird, and fully feel that. You don't necessarily have any word inside your mind. You just notice the bird. And then you notice that, off to the right, there's the sound of a chainsaw in the distance. You really hear that. That's noting. Yeah. Labeling is when you say a word that describes it. So for example, left shoulder, forehead, belly. So that's labeling. It's the noting. Every couple seconds, bring your full attention to something, holding it there for a couple seconds, then release, plus a word that describes what you're experiencing. So I think when you took my class, however long ago, I used the word noting to describe labeling. I really like what you're saying. I think I'd never put it in those terms, but I do think that labeling as well as noting does bring a real richness. It does bring that fullness, that vividness that we were talking about. I also think bring it back to ADHD. A big part of ADHD is hyperfocus. Right. I think neurotypicals do this to some extent, but just like you start reading about the old joke is someone when they first learn about hyperfocus, they'll read for 6 hours and forget that they need to go pee, and their body will be all stiff because they're reading about hyperfocus and they're so interested in it. This is so interesting. I've done this my whole life, right? So what happens when an ADHD person gets into hyperfocus, which again, everyone does, but especially ADHD people? The whole world disappears. You're locked into a project. You forget, self-care. You forget, maybe you have an appointment with someone if it gets really bad for someone that's really unconscious with their ADHD. One intervention there that people say is like set a timer that goes, Pomodoro or something. Every half an hour it goes off, bing. Okay, remember time exists. Remember, are you doing what you intend to be doing? You had a project you wanted to work on today. Have you gotten derailed just surfing the internet? So there's that external thing that goes ding and reminds you, or maybe your partner comes in like, hey baby, don't you have a client in half an hour? And you're like, oh yeah, right. What am I doing? Oh, I was just, doing this thing on my phone. Like I actually should pay attention to time. So sometimes for an ADHD brain, it requires something external to come in and be like, hey, are you actually doing what you intend to be doing? Yeah. My partner Emily asks me that question regularly. Yeah. You look like you're spacing out on your computer and maybe kind of just like surfing the web. Are you actually doing what you intended to be doing today? Yeah. And I think that's what labeling and noting does within a meditation. Yeah. It's sort of like, are you actually spaced out? You intended to be paying attention to the body. Are you actually every couple seconds saying the name of the part of the body? Yeah. So labeling, it's a very useful ADHD tool. I think it's great for everybody, but especially for ADHD people, it's that same thing as the external coping strategy of having something intrude on your consciousness to be like, have you gotten lost on the internet? Or are you actually like, being intentional?
Right. That's great.
So I read a little bit of Heidegger because I've watched a few of your other videos, so I thought we might talk about some Heidegger. Mm-hmm. So I have a few things to say about Heidegger if you're interested. Mm-hmm. One is, I thought he was like phenomenology, that was his thing, but it's not. He's kind of anti-phenomenology. If you're really in the moment, you kind of like lose the past and the future. I mean, you understand this so much better than I do. So this is just first impressions. So I wanted to say something about Sorge, do you know how to pronounce it? Care? That's a big thing he has.
Yeah, care. Mm-hmm.
So Sorge.
So I think
in German.
Sorge is the way
Sorge
in German, I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I should know since I learned German at the same time as English when I was a kid, but forgot it a long time ago. So I've seen you kind of, now that I'm learning a little bit about Heidegger, you know, the unconcealedness and all this stuff, I'm like, oh, this is in Guy's style of circling. Like the fact that care is inescapable.
Yeah.
Like when I see you work with people, you're like, okay, what's your investment? What's your emotional investment in your life and in yourself and in the people around you?
Yeah.
Like it's inescapable that a human's heart becomes intertwined with the world.
Yeah.
And like cares about things. So that's, you know, Heidegger, I guess, said that to be a Dasein, to be a being in the world, is to care, right? Yeah. In der Weltsein, being in the world.
Yeah.
And I thought about that, and you know, I think Heidegger was inspired by Schopenhauer, who was heavily inspired by Buddhism, but neither of them meditated.
Yeah.
So they were taking some of this like Eastern pantheistic or like unitary or, you know, transcendent thinking, but because they didn't, I actually wrote a paper in college about Schopenhauer read a lot of Buddhism, but he didn't meditate. So he took this kind of like unitive, you know, the world is this trap of this thing that, you know, gets you into compulsive craving without sort of feeling like the okayness or the transcendence of that comes from practice. So, you know, in Buddhism, there's this thing, a distinction between chanda and tanha. So tanha literally means thirst. It's often the second noble truth that like our suffering comes from impurity of mind. It's summarized as tanha or craving.
Right. Right.
So tanha is a motivation that a person has that's kind of like, I need it, you know?
Yeah.
I gotta avoid it. I gotta grab onto it, right?
Yeah.
So the classic impurities of Buddhism, leaning forward into life, I gotta have more alcohol. I gotta have that person's approval. Or like, I don't want to talk to them. I don't want to, you know, I don't want to like deal with that project because it's difficult. Attachment and aversion. Yeah. So that's tanha motivation. But then there's chanda. Chanda is like, it's motivation that's upright. You know, like you and our friends might say, I want that, but I'm not attached to it. So I think there's different kinds of care. I think when I've been listening to a little bit about what Heidegger said, care sometimes has that tanha meaning. We can't help but be attached to the world.
Yeah.
But you know, Adyashanti says, you know, to grow spiritually is to attenuate our energetic entanglement with the world. I think we can care about the world and really have investment in it without tanha. We can have that chanda, like I care. You know, there's a story about Gandhi that 2 years before he finally was killed, he was at a big rally, you know, his arms around his boys, and, you know, a Muslim who hated him from being Hindu or whatever, pulled a gun on him from 10 feet away. And if the guy had shot Gandhi, Gandhi would have been dead. And his guys, you know, his compatriots were diving to try and tackle the guy or diving out of the way so they wouldn't be shot. But so the story goes, Gandhi put his hands together and said, Ram. And if the guy kind of like lost his nerve and dropped the gun. Now, Gandhi didn't try and get out of the way. He didn't try and do it. He just was like God, you know, Ram being one of the Hindu names of God. That to me, I mean, of course, Gandhi cared. He cared so much. Yeah. You know, he had incredible care. And yet that level of non-attachment, I'm about to get shot to death. And what he did was say, God, you know, I see you. There's non-duality happening. If you shoot me, Ram Dass's interpretation of the story is, if you shoot me, it's your karma. I'm ready to go. Yeah. That's a level of like complete non-attachment while caring a lot. And so I think when we talk about care being sort of inherent in being, I think care can have a really gooey, impure, suffering-causing side to it, and can have a commitment without attachment side to it. Yeah. So I think that Buddhist way of talking about tanha motivation and chanda motivation is crucial when talking about sorge.
Yeah, totally. You know, what's interesting is actually I have a series on my channel of Christopher and I actually reading through a dialogue that Heidegger wrote between him and basically a student of one of his students, talking about essentially emptiness and Western philosophy and this ride back and forth. And at the end of his life, and I just heard this the other day from my friend Daniel, who said that Heidegger said to Nishitani, who, if you're familiar with the Kyoto school of philosophy in Japan, they're basically a group of Japanese philosophers who really went through the German tradition, the continental tradition, and and Heidegger was deeply influential in their thinking around that. And it is precisely because Heidegger was one of the few people that actually like looked at emptiness. And towards the end of his life, he said that Heidegger's notion of being is really the same thing as sunyata. I didn't realize that Heidegger said that. So it's like, when he's talking about being, really what he's getting at is essentially is he can't tell the difference between what he means by being and what the Buddhists talk about as sunyata. So there's a very, very, very close connection there, big time.
Heidegger said that, or the Japanese guy said that?
Heidegger said that.
Yeah, you know, about a month ago, I downloaded thousands of memes from the Reddit philosophy meme section, and so many of them had to do with meaninglessness and emptiness.
Right.
Because I think, you know, especially with hard sciences, physics, getting to a point of really examining reality,
yeah.
I think Western philosophy has reached this dead end of like, you can't say anything for certain,
yeah,
because it can always be undermined. And there's a nihilism that comes from that. A lot of these philosophy people seem to be wrestling with nihilism. And it gets to what I was saying about Schopenhauer.
Yeah.
You know, it's dangerous to encounter the truth of reality, its ultimate meaninglessness, and its ultimate insubstantiality without having practice.
Yeah.
It's like what I was saying about ethics first, then concentration, then do the cosmic work. It's like what I was saying about the value of cultivations, like loving kindness or gratitude, forgiveness, or, you know, may I be friendly with myself.
Yeah.
If a person doesn't have something to tether them to this world in a positive way, you encounter the ultimate truth of things, and it's just terrifying and rupturing, and can create a lot of nihilism and a lot of sort of sense of like, well, why not kill people? You know, why not?
Yeah.
And so I learning a little bit about Heidegger, you know, it's a bummer for me that he's an atheist, because I don't think he need to have a Christian Lutheran God, but just some sort of sense of larger oneness or a warm-hearted feeling of interconnection. I think if
Heidegger would consider himself an atheist.
That's what I heard.
Yeah, definitely. I
can see there are times
we're talking about it. Yeah, there's some rich subtleties. There's some rich subtleties in here. I mean, it's more like what Heidegger was really doing was realizing that in some sense, Western metaphysics really was all about trying to find a ground for beings, right? And in doing that, right, they made being something like an uber being, but that conceals being as such, right? Being as such, right? What is being that isn't associated with beings? What is our understanding of being as such? And whatever our understanding of being is as such is obviously is going to be our deepest understanding that underlies everything in itself. And that most of Western philosophy has been thrown into trying to ground beings. And Heidegger kind of came along and said that that's starting to come to its end. It really ended in Nietzsche. And that the difference was, he says that where you got to look at it, he says, and this is really subtle stuff, but like when he says that no, being itself is that which withdraws, right? It's that which withdraws from being, right? And in its withdrawal, right, creates the abground, right? Which isn't denialism. It's simply the openness for any cognition to be able to happen at all, right? It's the through the withdrawal of being, right, that affords the openness for us to be able to have a world, essentially. And so you can kind of hear in that this deeper sense of sunyata, right? And the deeper meaning of sunyata, and this kind of emptiness and this wholeness, not an emptiness, or not a groundlessness that's a function of a lack, but a groundlessness that is a kind of radical openness, right? That we can start to take up and contend with. Essentially, I think that's where Heidegger was going, and in that sense, I think he's arguably mystical, right? And that, And the whole thing with care, I mean, the thing to think about with care, you're right about like there's all these different ontic ways you can talk about care, but I think what he was talking about was that the human being, or Dasein, as he put it, right? It wasn't like it's not like we're a being that then cares. No, we are, in that we are at all is already a care, right? There's a fundamental way that we comport always towards a world, right? And that comporting, or that directionality, if you will, is this deep ontological sense of caring, right? This non-indifference, if you will, about that I always already find myself beholding a world with a first name and a last name and a body and everything already begun in the midst of being concerned about something or another, right? And so I think about like with meditation, where you kind of like, in some sense, where you start to let a lot of those comportments, like you notice them and you let them go. You notice them, you let them go, and you start to go deeper and deeper, as you said, like, you know, getting as much in front of the curtain of consciousness as possible is also this kind of this process of noticing and letting go, noticing, letting go, noticing, letting go. And what you start to dip back into, you could say, is care as such, right? Which is the thing that you're talking about, I think, which is this deep equanimity that, Gandhi can kind of like go, please shoot me, or like he can kind of lean into it.
I don't think he was please shoot me. He was just like, the moment's perfect, whatever happens.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's a profound relationship to care. Yeah.
What you're saying is a lot. I mean, it triggers a lot of thought in me, and I also think I'd have to hear it run by me a few times to fully get it.
Yeah.
I mean, I get it. What I'm getting is that Heidegger I know Heidegger's had a big influence on you. I've heard you talk about him for 15, 20 years, but also
I'd love for you to check out Being in Nothingness by Nishitani. He's basically a Zen monk who essentially looks at the whole Western tradition through the frame of Zen and runs it through that. And that's that book. I think you'd really dig it, actually.
Being in Nothingness.
Yeah. I have the PDF. I can send it to you.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm also getting, just listening to you, that Heidegger's like intellectually fun to think about, but also it's an experience for you. It's like your body relaxing into spaciousness, or sort of like encountering some sort of somatic bioenergies. When you contemplate these things or read these things, something's really, it's a phenomenological experience as well as sort of a concept for you.
Very much like a koan. Very much like a koan. Yeah. In fact, I would say that like in the beginning, because right when circling was starting was right when Niebauer had I had a Heidegger book on his table, and then I started reading Being in Time over across the street at Barnes and Noble, right when I lived over in by the Fisherman's Wharf there, and I would like read Being in Time and not understand anything I was reading, right? And then I'd go out to the beach and circle, go up to Arte and circle, and I didn't really quite understand the connection between the two, but I started. It was a few years later that I realized that there was something going on of what it took to read Heidegger, because it was so hermeneutically phenomenological. It's more like what it took to try to understand what he was saying had you stepped so far outside of your own frame to then look back to try to understand that you do that over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. At some point, I looked up in circling and I started noticing all this terminology that I hadn't really noticed before. It was Heidegger terminology. And I was like, oh, very funny, Mr. Heidegger. It's one of those things where it's not so much reading him for information as it is taking a particular walk in thinking, and in some sense being transformed by that, or being affected or changed by that. That's why I think it's like very Koan like. And this is why I think the Zen guys, right, in the Kyoto school, and Heidegger had a deep thing going on there towards the end of his life.
Yeah. I think that transformational experience, people can have that reading Plato or Kant or Hegel or Wittgenstein or especially Nietzsche. But, I think Heidegger had the advantage of having been exposed to all those beforehand.
Yeah, totally.
There's so much to talk about with all that you're talking about, but we need to wrap it up. 2 more things?
Yeah.
If we have time? Please,
yeah.
One is, I think being is healing. I think, I wondered about God when I was 16. And so my family didn't go to church. So I went down to the local church and got myself confirmed and baptized a Presbyterian. And I think I didn't really get some sort of sense of larger oneness. It just wasn't something I felt or understood.
Yeah.
And I think one of the first things that really made sense to me is that, like, you can have a gold necklace, you can have a gold ring, you can have a gold tooth filling, and they all take particular shapes, but you can melt it all down and make it gold and reform it into other things. Mm-hmm. So you could say there's some sort of like, larger vibe, the Holy Spirit or whatever. There's, you can talk about it on a physics level, subatomic particles. There's sort of like the being and then the various forms it takes and sort of the meanings we give that.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's similar to what you were saying about Heidegger, but I do remember I had a friend in college, in high school, actually, again, when I was first starting to think about this, and she was into existentialism. I'm like, what's existentialism? And she said, existence precedes essence, which is to say being is more important than the particularities of being.
Yeah.
And I think I think Heidegger also talked about that we can't help but be limited. That's something I guess, my brief cursory exploration, we can't help but be flawed. That's also Christian, right? The original sin. But so whoever we are, we're going to fail at something or not be good enough. Like, you can't be buff like a great fighter like MMA and be great at tax returns and have incredible communication skills and be able to paint water. Like, no humans are, like, by definition, like, limited. So I think to examine yourself in terms of, do I measure up? My essence is, there's always going to be some sort of sense of shame there, some sort of sense of not good enough. Whereas I think just to rest into how the body feels in this moment, like that fullness you talked about that comes in meditation, just that sense of I am. One of the great enlightened teachers of Vedanta in the 20th century was Nisargadatta Maharaj. And his practice was a classic Vedanta practice, which is just to say again, I am. Not I am a male, not I am 53, not I am, a Buddhist or whatever I am, not I am I live in the East Bay, but like I am. And I, when I was, just like, why is being so important here? I think it's just like, there is no shame in that I am.
Yeah.
You're connected with the larger I am. Your Atma touches Brahma. And so I think that, why is the fact of his existence as opposed to the way we exist? Why is that so compelling for people? And why does it feel like at rest? Why does it feel nourishing or peaceful or kind of like healing even? I think it's because that's where we do touch on the part of us that's not limited, that's not flawed, that is the kind of the gold that could melt into all sorts of different shapes.
Yeah.
So I kept thinking of that Nisargadatta's I am practice. I am when hearing about Dasein.
And there's that thing where it's like that. It's so interesting how on one level, like the I am, it presupposes everything. But at another level, in that it's so close in, it's so near, it can conceal itself in its nearness, right? So there's that that's the thing I really appreciate about meditation, is that there's and with Heidegger and the phenomenologists, is like, there's something about that turn of like looking what you're like, looking towards what you're looking with. The thing that's most near is the thing that's the most liberating, or can be the most liberating, but also is likely the most concealed. And so meditation for me is that kind of something about it that just keeps having you. And with the noting meditation, I feel like I get closer to just that sense of, that this is, right? This the simple fact.
Someone comes to you in a circling course, or they come on Thursday nights to your group, or they come to you as a coaching client, they come to me for meditation. They're worried about their 401k, they're worried about their growing paunch, they're worried about their kids, they're worried about, politics, they're worried. And so they're stressed out, they can't sleep at night, they're getting ulcers. So they their wife says to them, or their husband says to them, or whoever, you really need to take care of yourself and explore some forms of growth. So they come to you and they're like, can you help? They come to me, can you help me? I'm all wired up. I know I shouldn't worry so much. And it's like, I might say to them, well, just, where in your body do you feel sensation right now? Yeah. You might, you might work with them in a meditative way too, circling or coaching. You might say like, okay, notice that thought, notice it's rising and falling. I don't know, something like that. Notice that you care a lot about that. And then they're drawn into the moment, but they're also drawn into, I am a human being sitting right here with a mind creating a lot of things. And they drop into that level of being. Yeah. They drop into being in the moment means being, and so then there's a rest there. There's a sort of like there's a problem. There's something that's not working. There's something that needs to be different. It's seen as sort of the mind generating content on top of the I am. And that's when the ulcers go away and the person's able to sleep at night. Totally. So one last thing.
Yeah, please.
If you're up for it. When I was listening to Heidegger, I kept thinking about, or listening to teaching company people talk about Heidegger. Mm-hmm. I kept thinking of Vasubandhu. So Buddhism was actually not very transcendent in the time of the Buddha, its first 500 years. There wasn't really a transcendent element. You read the old scriptures, the Nikayas, a lot of it's about comportment. It's a lot about don't be a superstitious person, be generous, etc.
Yeah.
Ken Wilber would call it kind of like flatland. There wasn't a lot of depth to Buddhism before, around the time of Christ. There was the Mahayana Reformation. Then that's when it got cosmic. One of the main people that did that was this guy Vasubandhu, and his school was called the what would you call it? The mind only school, Chittamatra, or the Yogacara school. So I think you're going to like this if you've never heard it before. He had to teach. I wrote this down: the Trisvabhava, the three natures or the three worlds teachings. And again, listening to Heidegger, I kept thinking of this. So Vasubandhu's thing was like, there's this world of pure vibe. You could call it God, you could call it the Tao, you could call it Nirvana. There's something refreshing and eternal and unitive, and just kind of like, that's what we in our heart know we're seeking, is rest in that, contact with that, the experience of that. So, the I am, that where your individual soul merges with the cosmic soul. And Vasubandhu is like, you're never going to encounter that. Like Kant said, you are too feeble. Kant said the human being is too feeble to directly apperceive or experience God. Vasubandhu is like, that world of absolute transcendence, void, ultimate reality, the dharmata, you as a human being are too finite to ever contact that. Yeah. Oh man, we're stuck in the suffering limited self with our all these filtered perceptions. Yeah. And he's like, well, there's also the world. There's this computer, there's the tree out there, there's my hand, there's like the sound of my voice, there's the refrigerator, there's the cars, there's the, planets and stars. He's like, you know what? You're never going to directly apperceive that either. Yeah. Just like the little trick with the elbow, like there's so much more to the elbow than even when we bring our full attention to that. You will never really, you are too limited to directly perceive that. Oh man, he called that the parinishpana, the realm of causal dependency. What can we perceive? And then he talked about there's the world as it appears to you, the phenomenological. Yeah. Like right now I'm aware of this thought. Right now I'm feeling that my stomach's hungry. Right now I'm having the thought, am I monologuing for too long? Right now I'm feeling my left shoulder. And if you can really feel that, the more deep you can get, like what I was saying about the $10 burrito becoming the gourmet meal, the more you can actually feel the richness and the texture of the world as it phenomenologically seems to you, you get closer and closer to the world as things are beyond our perception, that second world. And the more that first world shines out of all things, the more you're very aware of how things seem to you, the more close you get to things as they are. It's sort of like a person that's really in their head will be like, well, you said that, and it's not what you said. They're not seeing you clearly. There's so many filters of their own beliefs, where someone that can get rid of those filters, and this is what you do as a coach, and I do as a coach, we really try and remove our own filters and see a person as clearly as possible. And that's when something numinous and something unitive and something completely refreshing and divine shines through. So that's the three worlds teaching, the Trisvabhava teaching. And I kept thinking of that when I was learning about Heidegger.
That's great. Yeah, that sense of like the way that Vervaeke and Chris talk about it. I love these two words. I think I got that sense as you're talking about, is like that place where the moreness and the suchness of something, right? The way that something's, you can like absolutely particular, right? As you would like to, you say like Mount Everest is not 27,000 feet up, it's 27,842, right? There's this kind of way where the
doing the same thing of that with the precise details of how your body feels, how your thoughts are, the sounds that you hear.
Yeah.
You're saying if you get to the particulars of something, I'm sorry,
it's what it is, and it's suchness, but it also discloses somehow its inexhaustibility, its moreness. There's something more that comes through the suchness and the moreness. And that's that that kind of whatever that thing is, right? Of that luminance.
The Dharmata.
Yeah. Guys, this has been really, really, really great. I'm so stoked. This will be our first conversation. I hope that we have more of these. In fact, it'd be great to have there's a couple of other meditators that I talk with too. Maybe we'll get a dialogos going with maybe a three-way or four-way at some point and riff on this stuff.
I'd be honored. Yeah, this has been enjoyable and fun for me. I appreciate the invitation, and yeah, I love you, Guy.
I love you too. And then I'll have your website and all that stuff below in the show notes.
Yep, intromeditation.com. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye, my friend.
Take care.